Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today on this webinar where we explore how you as an HR professional or business leader can support your employees to succeed in the new world of work. TMA World and Country Navigator bring you a powerful portfolio of learning tools that enables global leaders, managers, and individuals to achieve breakthrough levels of collaboration and performance. And I am delighted today to introduce Dr. Andy Brough. Andy has worked virtually for more than 20 years and brings over 25 years of expertise in leadership development, performance, and talent management. His doctoral research for his PhD examined the relationship between responsible leadership and corporate reputation. He has also supported global organizations, including ArcelorMittal, British Petroleum, Deutsche Bank, BMW, and many more. Andy will be taking questions at the end of this webinar, so please do share your questions via the chat function. Thank you again for being here today.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and welcome everybody to this remote working webinar, Helping Your Employees Succeed. I look forward to talking with you for the next 25 minutes around some of these key issues. Let me start by just creating some context for us in terms of business impact and how COVID-19 has brought us to this point. We know that it's the biggest health crisis since the Spanish flu of 1918. We've seen a massive fall across the different stock markets since the end of 2019, and the central banks in more than 50 countries cut interest rates. We also know that this is going to impact on supply chains around the world as thousands of companies are looking to throttle down or temporarily shut assembly. We estimate that maybe 320 million jobs would be affected as a result of the impact on travel, and global GDP growth is set to dip below 2%. All of this is going to fundamentally change the way that many organizations operate for the foreseeable future. And part of that change is that the coronavirus has meant social distancing has become mandatory. One of the things we'll talk about today is how we need to think about physical distance and still social connection. We've seen over the past week or so that there has been a mandatory decision that many people are now having to work from home. For some of us, that's not anything new. We've been doing it for many years. But for others, this instruction to work remotely immediately means that we are, to quote the chief executive of Unilever and also the head of the UK Chartered Management Institute, living in unprecedented times. And the impact of that, as Josh Bersin has said, is that many people, many employees are scared, and that we as leaders, as employers, and as colleagues need to find ways to create a sense of trust and shared responsibility and safety. And so this remote working creates a set of unintended challenges for us. It's about working across sites. It's about the differences that we see both generationally and functionally. And however we look at it, it's going to severely test old ways of thinking and working. And so in this presentation, I want to give you an overview on what we call the new world of work in terms of the VUCA reality. We'll talk about some of the barriers that our research has identified to effective remote working. And we'll also talk about some of the potential solutions using a collaboration model that we developed. And then I want to finish off by talking about how to build trust remotely and the importance of creating remote resilience. This idea of the VUCA world is one where, if we look at it through the lens of remote working, is now going to be incredibly volatile. Yesterday, I'm working in a co-located office, and today I'm sent home and I'm expected to work on my own, distant from everybody else. That's going to be a disruptive step change. It's also going to create high levels of unpredictability. How do I operate in this remote results-only work environment? What does it mean in terms of my schedule? What does it mean in terms of the rhythm of how I work? How am I expected to communicate? How often? Am I going to communicate too much or too little? So this is complex. The decision is not without serious ramifications for HR, for employers, and for people who are ultimately working in this new way. Because ultimately it's ambiguous. There are many things that are unconfirmed. The impact of the pandemic is a moving target, and how that will impact on how we respond is something we have to be pretty agile about in the way forward. So VUCA negative requires VUCA positive. What does that mean? From an HR and employer perspective, it needs leaders who will set very clear direction and champion progress in terms of this new way of working. Where there is uncertainty and unpredictability, we've got to work hard to make sense, to do that sense making, first of all for our employees and then for our customers around how this new world of work will look. That's going to require clarity. It's going to require clear communication. It's going to require concise management of expectations so that in the midst of this ambiguity, we can see people released who are agile, who are able to make continual necessary adjustments to how they work and to find their rhythm in for what some of them will be a completely new context. Now, a buffer state report was put out recently, the 2020 report, and in that report, they identified a number of challenges to remote working that I want to highlight and use as the entree to this presentation. A big one is the collaboration communication challenge. How do you ensure that you have business continuity and collaboration when people are no longer co-located? It is possible, it's not easy, but there are some suggestions we want to give you. The second thing is not only are you going to need to provide tools for communication and collaboration, but you're going to have to really ramp up your focus around loneliness. This fact that we are connected more than ever, but in many ways more isolated than ever. And so the loneliness factor, not just as we face the challenges of the pandemic, but having to work in this new environment is a real issue. And then, of course, the other thing that we see is that when you ask people to work remotely, very often the pendulum swings the other way, and they find it really difficult to switch off. They feel there's almost that unwritten expectation that they will be on 24/7 and that they can send and receive messages throughout the week and over the weekend. As Amir Salehevandich said, it's a case of not just a different way to work, but a different way to live. And I think even as we look to get through this pandemic, the decisions that have been made about remote working could mean that we don't go back ever again to the way that we worked before for many of us. I think if we come into this frame of reference from a leadership perspective, one of the key messages I want to leave you with today is to think leadership first and location second. As you adapt to these new ways of working, team leaders, effective team leaders, are going to have to learn how to demonstrate leadership presence, leadership empathy, care, vision, and direction without being physically present. That is possible. There are ways to do that, but it is going to require a mindset shift in the way that you approach this challenge. In terms of our research, we've identified 3 big barriers. The first is the one I've already identified, the isolation. Put yourself in the shoes of somebody who has only ever worked in a co-located environment, in an office environment. They've only ever had the privilege of working with people maybe a couple of feet on either side, and now they are immediately thrust into a remote team context for the first time. It's going to be challenging. And we as HR are going to need to be there for them to provide ways to overcome that isolation. The second barrier to remote working is fragmentation. We often see in remote teams that there is an overabundance of platforms, of reporting channels, of ways to document and track progress. And this is often overcome when you are co-located, but now that you can't see what other people are doing, it is quite likely that you may be asked to either input data into something or even to receive work in a format that is difficult for you to work on because members of the team are using other methods and systems. The isolation, the fragmentation is then really reinforced by the challenge of confusion, misunderstanding, ambiguity. One of the challenges with asynchronous communication when you work virtually is that it's not that great for articulating tonality, meaning, mood. Some things just need a face-to-face conversation. And so if you're only relying on email, if you're only relying on instant messaging, and not taking the time to really get onto a webcam and have that meaningful conversation, it does set the scene and the possibility for greater confusion going forward. So if you want to be successful in remote work, you've got to not only think about your job description and your performance agreement, but also about ways to countermeasure these three barriers. We have some suggestions on how to do that. The first one is to think engagement. Now, as HR professionals, when we think about that, we would always go back to the employee value proposition. That is still in place, but now we're talking about making those meaningful connections, where we're talking about physical distance, but social connection, checking in. How are you doing? What challenges are you facing? Do you have the support that you need? And making sure that as much as you are task focused, that you are also relationship focused in the way that you work. The countermeasure to fragmentation is cohesion. This is going to require agreement around how you work, around what you work on, around team priorities, and around roles and responsibilities. And the communication piece is going to be overcome in terms of clarity. This may mean a communication charter, a communication protocol, agreeing on what medium you will use, when and how often, and also deciding on the type of medium for the intent of the message that you have. One of the things that we see in remote teams is that often people default to what is easiest, but it's not necessarily the most effective. We also see an over-reliance on the asynchronous instant messaging and email, and that can often reinforce the lack of clarity and the misunderstanding. We developed 6 performance zones that we identified were critical to a virtual team. And so again, over and above the roles that you may be playing in your team, the first question you want to ask yourself is, how can we work well together? How can we build trust? How can we do that quickly? And one of the things we'll talk about later is this idea of building digital or virtual trust, which is somehow paradoxical in nature. The second question is, how do we make sure that there is alignment, that we all see the end goal the same, that there is a cascading of business, corporate, divisional, and team goals down to the individual role player so that we are pulling in the same direction. The third performance area is coordination. Roles, responsibilities, timelines, milestones. How do we stay organized and keep things moving in this particularly volatile environment? Recognizing that we will need to be much more specific about doing a skills audit, both at an individual and team level, to identify what our team performance capabilities are, and asking the questions formally and informally as to where those skills might be in the team. This is not just about specific to the job, but who are those people who can not just create new knowledge, but also disseminate new knowledge? Who are those who can be the guardians of the channels? Who are those who are good at looking after the repositories? Those are also skills that will be important when you work remotely. Along with that, the communication piece that we've spoken about. Communicating clearly so that we pay attention to each other. And one of the things we'll talk about in a moment is the penalties of cognitive switching and multitasking. And then finally, particularly for those of you who are working across time zones and geographies, this is not just about social distance, but it's also about geographic and cultural distance. And here we talk about this idea of developing your cultural intelligence as a conductor in an orchestra, where diversity is a fact, but inclusivity is a choice, where you are celebrating the differences in your virtual team and you're getting those musicians playing different instruments, but playing the same sheet music at the same tempo. This then creates the idea of the architecture for 6 C's of collaboration. You will see that the barriers to isolation are overcome with engagement. The barriers to fragmentation are overcome with cohesion. And the barriers to confusion are overcome with clarity. What is the level of trust in my team is the question that cooperation asks. How are we aligning is the question that conversion asks. How are we synchronized is the question that coordination asks. What is the level of our knowledge and expertise in the team is the question that capability asks. Are we generating shared understanding not just across borders, as it says here, but for many of you, you may still be in the same town, you may still be in the same region, but you're not sharing the same office anymore. How do we make sure that that shared understanding is still happening? And then for those of you who are now being asked to work with members of teams from different countries, how are you being inclusive of value and style differences? The paradox that I spoke about is this, that there's plenty of research to show that the further away I am from you geographically, the less likely I am to trust you. However, the further away I am from you geographically, the more I need to trust you. And so we know there's plenty of evidence that virtual teams depend on high levels of trust and cooperation. But the paradox is that often technology to communicate delays, using technology to do that, often delays trust and makes it more fragile. The traditional thinking that we had about team development of forming, storming, norming, performing doesn't necessarily apply, because now you come into the virtual team, you're being asked to work with people who you've never met sometimes, and you have to assume 100% swift trust from the beginning. How do you demonstrate that virtual trust? By keeping your word, by honoring the social contracts, by showing up when you said that you would, by demonstrating competency, by being comfortable with self-disclosure, and by guaranteeing that you have an agenda which is mutual and which is not just self-serving, but ultimately is going to put the person you are asking to do something in the most positive light as well. Here are some thoughts around building trust across distance. We're not going to go through all of them. Think about consistency, being predictable. That doesn't mean that you will respond to every request and every email in 3 minutes, but it does mean that people know when they do reach out to you that they are guaranteed of a response in an acceptable period of time. Maintaining confidences, giving people opportunities to contribute, and again, being very clear about roles. These are just some of the basic building blocks for building trust across distance. There's plenty of evidence that shows that even if you have all the technology in place, it is not necessarily the case that people can function well in a virtual team if you don't have these elements in place. What destroys trust? Lack of consistency, lack of confidentiality, and role confusion. Just some of the things that we need to think about as we embark on this new way of working. Let me also talk about the fact that if we're going to be working in this new way, we need to create opportunities for remote resilience. We need to make sure that our people don't burn out. And how do we do that? We need to give them that ability to have a self-service mindset, that not everything will come to them, and that they will need to learn to reach out and to ask for support, to ask for help, to flag when they feel that they're not given the resources that they need. They're also going to need to think about their workspace, to prioritize ergonomics. Is it a functional workspace? Do they have a comfortable chair? Do they have a space where they can really perform optimally? And I think the other thing is this is a results-only work environment. We shouldn't be celebrating the long hours. We should be celebrating the results. What that means is, for some of us, we will have to reinforce and establish very clear boundaries between work and home. This is not about work and life balance, it's about work-life integration. For some of us, those boundaries are thick. I have the privilege of working in a home office that is dedicated. I have all of the gear that I need to make that possible. And in my mind, I come to work, I dress for work, I take lunch breaks, I end my day, and there's a very clear boundary. It's a thick boundary. For some of you, it may be a thinner boundary. It may be that you work early before the family gets up. You then go and do what you need to do, and you come back and you continue at another time. You may not necessarily have a dedicated work environment. You may be working out of the kitchen or a bedroom. You may have a very small area in the home that becomes your home office. So setting up those boundaries and determining the thickness or thinness of those and establishing the routines becomes really important. One of the things that I've noticed is that we fall into this trap when we work remotely of multitasking. And the problem there is that we can, because we have so many windows and screens and apps and pieces of technology open, but the problem is it's not necessarily productive. And we now know that every time if you're doing a complex task that you pick up an email or you are interrupted, the cognitive switching penalties run into 15 minutes, 20 minutes every time. And that ultimately can cause huge stress in terms of meeting deadlines. I think it's going to be critical from an HR perspective that we intentionally build that social cohesion remotely, and that we have that sentiment tracking in place, both informally and formally, to check on the well-being, on the mental well-being of our teams, particularly as they work during this time. Stress levels are up. People are feeling very concerned about unknowns, and now we put on an additional requirement of them to work in this new way, and we need to do all that we can to support them and to make sure we have a finger on the pulse in terms of how they're coping. Let me also say that in a recent poll conducted by Gartner, there was clear indication that poor technology and infrastructure is one of the biggest barriers to effective remote collaboration. And so it goes without saying that we need to do everything we can to make sure that our teams have the necessary hardware and software and bandwidth. But it goes beyond that. We work with many organizations that have all of this in place, but they've recognized that if they don't have the social connections, they have nothing. So building trust is not going to happen by accident. You've got to over-communicate in a remote environment, and you need to create some predictability and regularity in terms of the drumbeat rhythm to your meetings. You've got to be much more explicit about boundaries and expectations. You've got to recognize that you can create a culture virtually. And one of the things I really want to endorse is that you look for opportunities to create those virtual water cooler moments, whether that's using a SharePoint where you have electronic bios, where you ask people to check in and they have opportunities to share what's happening in their world, and also that you take time to do the virtual celebration. That could mean, as I've seen many companies now doing, the virtual happy hour, but making that a priority in the virtual world is really important. I can't appeal to you enough that as we work remotely, the technology is one piece, the social connection is the other, and that we are required, I think, to consider the well-being of our remote contributors, not assuming that everybody has what they need in terms of the support, and that we have got a finger on the pulse in terms of the health and safety issues in the home. As I conclude this, let me finish with 3 top tips for HR and for business leaders, and then I'll ask Nikki if we have any questions. The first is, I think hiring will change. So we're going to need to set up new job descriptions for working remotely. And as HR professionals, we will need to role model new ways of adapting to this new world of work. For some of us, it's going to mean we need to be upskilled so that we can do that. In terms of onboarding, there may need to be some job shadowing, there may need to be some job sharing, but I think at a psychological contract level, that level 3, that's going to be even more important. It always was, but I think in the remote working environment, showing people that they're valued, that they're part of an inclusive climate, that they are acknowledged, that it's not a case of out of sight means out of mind, is absolute priority. And then the final point I want to make is this engagement piece again. If we go back to where we started in terms of the barriers, the isolation, the fragmentation, and the confusion, HR and business leaders are going to have to do a lot more intentional communication, both formally and informally, much more than normal, to engage with remote employees, to make sure that we have a sense of where they are, of what they're struggling with. And it is not easy, but it is possible. Let me say in conclusion, I have many great relationships with people around the world who I've never met, but who I count as close colleagues and friends. And the reason for that is because we've been intentional in building those relationships. I wish you every success. Nikki, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was extremely insightful. I think what resounded with me is the fact that HR professionals, but also business leaders, are going to have to really step up, and make the difference here in supporting people to become more effective if they want to have any semblance of business as usual. We've got a couple of questions here, and I'm hoping there'll be more coming through. One of the first questions for you, Andy, is the buffer survey that you mentioned briefly before talks about the inability to unplug as a real challenge. Do you have any tips or any do's or don'ts that you can share here, which people can use to avoid that?
So Nikki, I hope you can still hear me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Let's just go back to there. I think that there are two ways to tackle that. The one is to take a more mandatory view, as they've done in parts of Germany, where they will actually switch off people's email after hours so that they're actually unable to access that. I think that that's less than helpful in this environment because many of us are working across multiple time zones. The other is just to have that respect of sharing the pain when it comes to working across multiple time zones. So having the discipline, I think, to log out, not to have the expectation that you will be responding to emails at midnight your time, but also being predictable enough that if something does come through, that people know that you will respond in an appropriate amount of time. I do get that there are emergencies. I do get that there are crises. I do understand that there will be times when it's unavoidable. But I think setting those disciplines early on in the team, setting the expectations and role modeling those from a leadership point of view is absolutely critical. If we are the ones sending out those emails at midnight of the time of the recipient, they will feel obligated to respond. So either you send it out with a very clear direction that this is only for response the following day, or you only send it out conscious of the timeframes within which the recipient is working.
Thank you, Andy. The other question we have is, should we organise small talks or informal contact moments? And if yes, do you have any suggestions on how?
So the answer is absolutely. And one of the immediate ways to do that is when you are connecting into a conference call. First thing I would say is don't be afraid of coming onto camera. That is a massive step change for many people because they haven't done that. We work with companies, again, who've actually made that mandatory. But in that moment, when you get an opportunity to see the other person's eyeballs, maybe build in a buffer into the meeting, doing the social check-in, asking the questions, not just making it small talk for the sake of small talk, but really intentionally wanting to find out how people are doing, I think will have to become almost part and parcel of how we run our meetings. At the same time, as I said earlier, we have teams that use things like Yammer. They have other social presence technologies. Some of them are more effective than others. I think you've got to give people a reason to want to engage. If it's simply another task or duty that they have to fulfill, most people will not do that. But if you can find a pull method to attract people to go somewhere where they can then engage socially, that seems to work a lot better. So those would be my two tips, Nikki. The one is the social check-in, if you can, for every team meeting, or if not every team meeting, at least once a week. And the other would be to create those social presence opportunities using the collaborative tools. One of the things that I shared earlier today was that GitLab, who has done some phenomenal work around working remotely, have actually set up a remote handbook. And all of this they put into the remote handbook. It is open source, and anybody that comes into their organization is asked not just to read through that, but also invited to contribute. The one point I would make, Nikki, I think is it's really important to document whatever you're doing in a remote team so that you reduce that uncertainty.
Absolutely, completely agree with that. One of the other questions we have, Andy, for you is, do you have any tips for working with mixed language abilities? So how do you help non-native speakers feel more involved in the remote situation?
It's really good. And it's a great question. And it's something that we have engaged over the years and encountered a lot. I think you've got to give people different channels to engage with. So one of the things that I've seen when I'm working with people who are not necessarily first language speakers is they're often, ironically enough, more comfortable to type into a chat bar than they are to come on and speak on audio. So as much as I've been saying, get onto webcam and eyeball people and talk to them, I think you've got to tease people in. And even if you can get the people who are not always that comfortable to come out of themselves and really reveal themselves, often there's a language issue. If you create another channel, like a chat box or something where they could start to warm up there, that can often be a simple way to do that. I think the other point, of course, is we've got to slow down. So it will mean that when you're working with people from other languages, you've got to take time, you've got to be checking in. Often it's good to ask them to repeat back to you what you've asked or what you've explained so that you can check understanding. And I think where necessary, it may even be if have somebody localized who does speak the mother tongue language who can help with translation if necessary. I don't think there's a perfect science, Nikki. I think many companies who have business English as the lingua franca will continue to struggle with this. We will need patience, but as you coach people, as you role model it, and as you are very careful not to adopt an air of superiority, I think that's the other thing that's important. You will find that people warm to this and they become a lot more confident in speaking the business English that I think you're referring to.
Thank you, Andy. And in a similar tone, I think almost, there's another question around, in your experience, are there generational differences in the way individuals embrace remote working that people should be aware of as HR professionals or leaders?
So that's a really interesting question, Nikki. I think on the one hand, we would assume that the generation that's working or coming into the workforce now is much more technologically astute, and that is true, but they are also looking for the social connection. And so many of them are looking for the privileges of working remotely, but still have the opportunity to check in. I don't think there's any question about their savvy in terms of the digital language and the digital fluency, but it's about getting them to understand the need to be professional, getting them to understand how they can collaborate, and asking them to be much more transparent in how they're working, to understand that this is not so much about the time that they take to do something, but the results that they articulate. It may also mean that we've got to be much more deliberate in more frequent milestones so that they are held to account and that we ensure that we are tracking what's going on. I think all of those things are important. At the same time, I work with many people who are senior to me age-wise. They have embraced much of this technology. I'm working with a group of 50 pluses who are in many cases looking to come back into the workforce, and they are embracing this opportunity to be upskilled in online technology. And I think for many of them, where they thought they might be surplus to requirement maybe a couple of years ago, they now see an opportunity to re-engage in the workforce with a vengeance, and they're up for the challenge. So I think we should watch that space, Nikki.
Thank you, Andy. You know, I'm seeing one last question that we might take just before, because I'm conscious we are a couple of minutes over. Great talk, thank you. We work across many different countries and levels of digital infrastructure. You mentioned using different channels. What are you seeing organizations do to be as inclusive as possible in light of varying levels of internet connectivity, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, as I said earlier in the Gartner research, the internet connectivity, I think, is going to be one of the big barriers. But as I also said, even in companies that have all of the bandwidth and all of the technology, the collaboration is still a challenge. So we need to fly this plane on both sides. We've got to make sure that people have at least a connectivity that is, going to do the minimum. And in terms of platforms, yeah, there are so many platforms, Nikki, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to mention them specifically. I think if people just go out there and look at collaboration tools, I think it's less about the platform. I want to make that point. There is no problem right now as we sit here on the 23rd of March about the availability of platforms. I think it's how you use those platforms. I think it's getting people to agree on which platforms to use. And certainly in the midst of this crisis, the other thing that I would say is less is more. You probably want to take a more stripped down approach, probably pick a primary channel for communication and for collaboration, maybe have a backup. Think about where you want to interact and where you want to store information, and then drive people to use those platforms in a way that really gets them to engage in a collaborative way. I think that's the key thing that I want to say about that question, Nikki.
Thank you, Andy. I hope you found that helpful. I'm going to wrap this up now. We've got a couple more questions, but I'm going to wrap it up for the sake of time. Thank you so much, Andy. We will come back to those questions and reply to people that have asked them. I hope you've enjoyed today's webinar and found it as useful as I personally have, and look forward to connecting with our audience again another time. Have a lovely rest of the afternoon and rest of the week, everyone, and stay safe. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Nikki.